On a frigid January night in 2011, a 911 call shattered the quiet of a Philadelphia apartment building. The air was thick with tension as emergency lights flickered against the brick facade, signaling that something terrible had happened within those walls. Sam Goldberg, a young TV producer, returned home after a long day, only to find the door to his apartment locked from the inside. Confused and increasingly anxious, he tried the handle again and again, but it wouldn't budge. He called out for his fiancée, Ellen Greenberg, his voice echoing down the empty hallway. But there was only silence, no footsteps, no reply, just a chilling stillness that made his heart race. In a panic, Sam broke down the door, desperate to get inside and find out what was wrong. The force of his fear propelled him through the entryway. Inside, he found Ellen, a beloved first-grade teacher, lifeless on the kitchen floor with a knife embedded in her chest. The sight was so shocking, it barely seemed real. A nightmare unfolding in his own home. The scene was brutal. Multiple stab wounds, blood pooled on the tile, and a locked door that seemed to defy explanation. It was a tableau of violence that no one could have anticipated. Police arrived quickly, treating the apartment as a potential homicide scene. Officers moved methodically, searching for clues and trying to make sense of the chaos. The locked swing bar on the door became a central mystery. How could anyone leave and relock it from the inside? Ellen's family was devastated, struggling to process the impossible. She was planning her wedding, excited for the future, and surrounded by friends and family who adored her. Her life was full of promise, and she was looking forward to a new chapter. The idea that she could be the victim of such violence was unthinkable. The news sent shockwaves through her community, leaving everyone reeling. Yet, even more shocking was the conclusion authorities would soon reach. The investigation would take a turn that no one expected. The initial shock of her death quickly gave way to a battle over what really happened in apartment 603. The story became a media sensation, with headlines speculating about every detail. For her loved ones, the questions were immediate and haunting. Who could have done this? How could such a tragedy occur behind a locked door? The uncertainty was unbearable. The locked room detail would fuel years of controversy and debate. Experts, journalists, and internet sleuths all weighed in, each with their own theories. For Ellen's family, the nightmare was just beginning. Grief was compounded by confusion and a desperate need for answers. The fight for answers would last more than a decade, as her loved ones refused to let her story be forgotten, and continued to search for the truth behind the locked door of apartment 603. The autopsy revealed 20 stab wounds, 10 to Ellen's neck and head, 10 to her chest and abdomen. At first, the medical examiner ruled it a homicide, but soon after the ruling was changed to suicide, citing no evidence of a struggle, no forced entry, and only Ellen's DNA on the knife. The locked door was seen as proof no one else could have been involved. Authorities suggested Ellen, despite her outward happiness, was suffering from severe anxiety. They theorized she inflicted the wounds herself in a moment of crisis. Ellen's parents, Josh and Sandy Greenberg, were stunned. They couldn't accept that their daughter would do this. The idea of self-inflicted wounds, especially to the back of her neck, seemed impossible. For the Greenbergs, the suicide ruling was not closure, but the start of a painful fight for justice. The official narrative left them with more questions than answers. The city's suicide theory relied on several key points. The apartment was locked from the inside, with no sign of forced entry or struggle. Only Ellen's DNA was found on the knife and her body. Her fiancé Sam's alibi was airtight. No defensive wounds were present, and her fingernails were clean. Investigators cited Ellen's recent anxiety and job stress, noting she'd sought psychiatric help. The wounds were described as hesitation marks, with the final deep stab to her chest seen as the fatal act. Authorities believed Ellen acted alone, in a sudden mental health crisis. The official story: a young woman, overwhelmed, took her own life in a locked apartment. For the city, the evidence fit together. Case closed. But for many, the explanation never made sense. The locked door and lack of outside DNA became the pillars of the city's case. Ellen's parents never accepted the suicide ruling. They argued the violence of the scene and the nature of the wounds, especially those to the back of her neck, made self-infliction impossible. Their experts said a wound severing Ellen's spinal cord would have incapacitated her, making further self-inflicted wounds unlikely. The family pointed to additional bruises, missing surveillance footage, and a potentially toxic relationship with her fiancé. A new report documented 20 more bruises than the original autopsy, suggesting a struggle. The Greenbergs believed the investigation was flawed and too quick to rule out homicide. Their independent experts concluded the evidence pointed to murder. They questioned whether the locked door could have been manipulated. For the family, every detail told a story of homicide, not suicide. Their fight was about more than a death certificate. It was about justice for Ellen. The 20 stab wounds on Ellen's body are at the heart of the controversy, raising questions that have haunted investigators and her family alike. 10 of these wounds were clustered on her chest and abdomen, while the other 10 were found on the back of her neck and head, an unusual and deeply troubling pattern. Experts for the family argued that a deep wound to her spinal cord would have caused immediate paralysis or unconsciousness, making it physically impossible for Ellen to continue inflicting wounds on herself after that point. A 3D analysis commissioned by the family meticulously mapped the angles and depths of each wound, revealing that many were inconsistent with self-infliction, especially those on her back and neck. The city's official report acknowledged the wounds were unusual, but still maintained that Ellen could have inflicted them herself, despite the doubts raised by independent experts. In the latest review, 31 bruises were documented, many of which had not been noted in the original autopsy, suggesting that something may have been missed or overlooked in the initial investigation. The family's experts believe these bruises are classic defensive wounds, clear evidence that Ellen tried to protect herself during a violent struggle. The city dismissed this interpretation, but for the Greenbergs, the bruises are silent testimony to a confrontation that cannot be explained away. The wounds and bruises remain the most powerful arguments against the suicide theory, challenging the official narrative at every turn. For Ellen's family, the forensic evidence tells a story the city refuses to hear, a story of violence, resistance, and unanswered questions. The debate over the wounds is far from settled, and for those seeking the truth, the evidence continues to demand answers. The case is defined by a battle of experts, each bringing their own interpretation to the evidence and fiercely defending their conclusions. Dr. Marlon Osborne, the original pathologist, first ruled Ellen's death a homicide, then changed it to suicide after consulting with police investigators and reviewing additional information. Years later, under mounting legal pressure and public scrutiny, Dr. Osborne reversed his opinion once again, stating Ellen's death should not be classified as suicide, reigniting controversy. Despite this reversal, the city's current chief medical examiner, Dr. Lindsay Simon, reaffirmed the suicide ruling in a new, detailed 32-page report, standing by the original police findings. The city's report cited Ellen's history of anxiety and the lack of evidence for an intruder, emphasizing the absence of forced entry or signs of a struggle. Meanwhile, the Greenbergs' team of independent forensic specialists conducted their own investigation and concluded the evidence pointed to homicide, challenging the city's narrative. Both sides presented detailed analyses, blood spatter patterns, wound biomechanics, psychological profiles, and timelines, each piece fueling further debate. The result? 2 groups of experts, 2 irreconcilable conclusions, and a case that seems to grow more complex with every new opinion. The truth remains buried under layers of conflicting professional opinions, with each report raising new questions instead of answers. Even the experts can't agree on what really happened in apartment 603, leaving the case shrouded in uncertainty. The official narrative and the family's case are locked in stalemate, with neither side willing to concede. The mystery only deepens with every new report, as the search for answers continues and the debate rages on. Refusing to let Ellen's case fade, the Greenbergs took their fight public. They filed lawsuits, forcing the city to re-examine the case and release documents. A 2024 settlement led to a new review, but the city again ruled Ellen's death a suicide. The family's attorney called the report a flawed attempt to justify a predetermined conclusion. The Greenbergs turned to the media, sharing Ellen's story on news outlets and true crime podcasts. An online petition to reopen the case gained over 167,000 signatures. Public pressure mounted, culminating in a Hulu docuseries, Death in Apartment 603. The documentary brought national attention and renewed scrutiny to the case. Even the city's chief medical examiner reviewed the series as part of her investigation. The Greenbergs' campaign ensured Ellen's story would not be forgotten. In October 2025, the city closed its latest review, again ruling Ellen's death a suicide. Dr. Simon's report focused on Ellen's anxiety and lack of evidence for homicide. The report addressed the wounds and bruises, calling them unusual but possible in a suicide. It dismissed claims of an abusive relationship and explained the locked door as proof Ellen was alone. The family's attorney condemned the report as a distortion of facts. The city's stance widened the gulf between officials and the Greenbergs. For the family, the review was another failure of the system. They believed the city ignored critical evidence and expert opinions. The official story stands, but the family's resolve only grows stronger. The case remains far from over. 14 years later, Ellen Greenberg's death remains a haunting mystery. The city's official story, a young woman, overwhelmed by anxiety, took her own life in a locked apartment. The family's story, a brutal murder, staged to look like suicide, ignored by authorities. Every piece of evidence has a counter-argument: locked door, wounds, bruises, expert opinions. The case is a stark example of how facts can be interpreted in opposite ways. The public is left to wonder, was Ellen a victim of hidden turmoil, or of a killer who staged the perfect crime? Lawsuits and debate continue, with no definitive answers. The Greenbergs' fight for justice is not over. The case endures because it exposes the limits of forensic certainty and the fallibility of justice. For Ellen's family, and thousands who follow her story, the search for truth goes on. The mystery of apartment 603 remains unsolved.